So we have a talk on challenges and solutions in real-world data collection through expanded access programs with Graham, Edith, Rakesh, and Haley. And I know that I posted a poll earlier today, which has some great responses. So it currently looks like we have the most votes on regulatory considerations, which is at 45%, with optimizing the strength of data collection through EAP and maximizing uptake second place at 30%. So guys, I will leave you to it and look forward to hearing some elaborations. Oh, and I think Rakesh is still, he did click to join, but it might be that he just needs to try again. But Graham, I'll let you start, and I'm just going to stay on the stage to make sure Rakesh gets on, but yeah, I'm sure that will be okay.
Yeah, thank you, James, and thank you for all the speakers so far. Some really insightful presentations and discussions. Given we're in the midst of a global pandemic and unable to mix in person, level of interaction has been great. The chat facility and even the speed networking has really enabled some decent engagement. Actually, when I spoke to my wife about my day yesterday, she initially thought I said I'd been speed dating, which which took a little bit of explaining. So for those of you who I haven't met, I'm Graham Sidorovich. I work at Bionical Emas. Bionical Emas is a specialist CRO that has a unique EAP platform. Collection of real-world data is fundamental to our EAPs, so we have vast and comprehensive experience on this subject. Thanks for great sessions on real-world data through EAP. Firstly, Veronique and subsequently Philip. It set the scene perfectly, really, for this panel discussion, where we've got a group of experts on the subject, and we'll be exploring the challenges and solutions in real-world data collection through EAP. So James mentioned the poll. That's a list of hot topics that we decided to share in advance, and we can see 3 of the 4 are indeed hot, and one of them got 0 votes. So perhaps our synopsis of hot topics needs redressing a little bit, but very clear where the results are. We will unlikely be able to get through all of those, but hopefully we get some depth on certainly the top 2 subjects just there. So there are 2 caveats to our discussions. Firstly, as Donna Cowan described yesterday, and Philip just in the prior presentation, expanded access is a US-centric term. So we're referring to EAP in the broadest sense, applying to all key global regulatory mechanisms. And finally, we're explicitly referring to real-world data collection through these programs, which is not company-sponsored research. So our first panelist and subject matter expert is Edith Eby. Edith is Vice President, Worldwide Medical and Safety at Pfizer. She reports to the Chief Medical Officer, Doctor of Pharmacy, and has practiced in pediatric oncology for nearly 10 years before joining Pfizer. And has now been at Pfizer for 18 years. Edith has responsibility for global medical operations, medical quality governance, and EAP. Pfizer's EAP function is global and manages an average of 500 requests per month. So really great experience and insights to share just here. So Edith, by way of introduction to the discussion, could you share your viewpoint from a pharma company perspective? Why collect data in an EAP and what challenges do you face?
Well, thank you, Graham, for the kind introduction and for the invitation from Bionical to participate on the panel today. Much of what I'm going to share has been shared by my peers today regarding EAPs, the why we collect data and what are some of the challenges. But I would like to start with a point that others have raised, and that first, that expanded access data collection is secondary to the data that we collect as sponsors for pivotal trials and will never replace them. However, with that said, there are unique situations, and I would say 3 primary reasons that we look to collect data in this setting. The first is that we're finding often regulators may be asking for supplemental data as part of our filing. So that supplemental data can help us with the regulatory filing, and in the end, ultimately help us provide access to medicines for patients. The second primary reason is related to the ability to publish information for treating patients with an investigational medicine that either we're not eligible for the trial, and that's why they're receiving the mechanism, the medicine through this route. And this helps inform other treating physicians regarding these patient populations that may have not been included in the trial, or in those rare disease populations where we have very limited patients. And so this route of action improve, and that will allow us to publish that data and make it available for other treating physicians. And then the third reason is related to informing our potential future research efforts in areas of unmet need. Obviously, we can't fund research in every area where we might find a signal for efficacy. So this opportunity in providing an investigational medicine pre-approval can help inform our decision-making for those areas. Now, with the reasons why, you asked me to share some of the challenges that we faced and others that industry has faced around the single patient expanded access request. I think it's been mentioned many times, and I'll punctuate that the quality of the data is probably one of the key challenges that we really look to manage and ensure that how do we best use this real world data and ensure the best quality that we can in that data, as we know it's not equal to the quality of the data that submitted as part of our randomized clinical trial and our sponsored trial. Now, other challenges from the patient lens is an education opportunity, an understanding of what are they participating in, and we need to obtain their consent, and we need to think about privacy for the patient. From our treating physician perspective, it has been raised by other presenters that they're participating in this, and we're asking for them to provide the data during their own time. This is treatment, it's not research. At Pfizer, we don't compensate physicians for providing this data. And so we need to be mindful about the number of data points collected to enhance their participation. And then the final challenge I'll raise is that there are diverse regulatory requirements, not consistent among all the countries, especially so many different regulatory requirements in the European Union. And there's different views on what expanded access means. You mentioned in your introduction how the term is used. The expanded access is US-centric, and there's so many terms. So I think that for us is a challenge as we think about how we best use this data that patients are providing to us.
Thank you, Edith. Our next subject expert is Hayley Belly. Hayley's Assistant Professor of Biostatistics in the Department of Population Health at New York University Grossman School of Medicine. She conducts research in the design, conduct, and analysis of pragmatic clinical trials, but importantly to this subject, co-chairs the NYU Division of Medical Ethics, Ethics and Real-World Data Working Group, and is a member of their Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access Working Group. Hayley, welcome to the panel. We see this question crop up frequently, but at a very high level, in order to make data more robust, what are the key considerations when through the viewpoint and lens of data collected through EAP?
Yeah, so thank you for the introduction, Graham. So ultimately, those key considerations involve ensuring that one is taking appropriate measures to collect quality data. So the follow-up question then becomes, how do we actually assess and ensure we have that quality data collection? So first, we need to identify the purpose of the data collection. So for example, in a randomized controlled trial, the study protocol clearly delineates the primary, secondary, and exploratory outcomes. Therefore, when collecting real-world data from an expanded access program, we know that expanded access programs are intended for treatment, not research. So it's important to think about how are the biases being introduced when we're collecting these data. And then what are also some of these other sources of error, just because we're going through a mechanism that is treatment-based, not primarily intended for research. So an example might be that a randomized controlled trial has full-time research staff dedicated to rigorous data collection and entry and cleaning. And it's also critical to examine what data may be missing when we're dealing with an expanded access program, and what are the reasons for those missing observations, as that provides clues as to maybe what is the safety or tolerability of the medical product. So after we identify the purpose of the data collection, we need to also consider our population, and namely whether there is sufficient heterogeneity, gender, socioeconomic status, or even the location where the data is being collected, so rural, suburban, or urban environment. And so obviously the more heterogeneity in our population, the more generalizable that data will be, and hence truly representative of real-world data. Next, we should consider the reliability and accuracy of the data. So for example, are these outcomes patient self-reported, clinician reported, or are they automatically being extracted from, say, some wearable or mobile device? Even if it's the latter, think that there's also error associated with technology. And we also need to consider the frequency of those measurements. So do we just have pre and post treatment, or do we have longitudinal continuous patient monitoring? And then finally, we just need to consider general sources of causality. So we know that real-world data often do not include randomization. There's likely no subject or physician blinding, and probably no control or reference group. So this limits that gold standard evidence that can be drawn from real-world data, but it leads to this idea of emulating a target trial. And so in simple terms, essentially with our real-world data, we want to frame what is the analogous clinical trial that you would perform were this an experimental design. So establishing key components that you'd see in a clinical trial protocol, such as defining your eligibility criteria, your endpoints, your outcomes, and what is your statistical analysis plan.
Thank you, Hayley. And our final panelist is Rakesh Dabda. Hey Rax. Rax is our head of real world data and market access at Bionical Emas. Background in medium to large pharma, working across a range of commercial, medical and market access roles. The importance of generating data to reduce uncertainty inspired Rakesh to undertake a master's in international HTA, pricing and reimbursement. He currently supports clients to focus on EAP real-world data collection to supplement broader strategic objectives, and has pretty comprehensive experience now in oncology, hematology, and rare diseases. Rakesh, from a specialist CRO perspective, what are the most important considerations when designing and setting up real-world data collection through an EAP?
Thank you, Graham, and hello, everyone. Great to be a part of this discussion today. Coming at this from, I suppose, historically being in industry and now being in a specialist provider of this type of service, working exclusively in real-world data, I can come to this from a position, I suppose, where we can think this data is fantastic for certain situations, but I think we need to reiterate that the explanatory trials that have been discussed yesterday and this morning, we still need them when it comes to, focusing on the safety, the quality, and the efficacy of treatments. There's no doubt that those will be the main point of call for this kind of information. And EAP should prioritize the unmet clinical need of patients. And when designing real-world data collection, it's extremely important to have this in the process flow. So when we design a real-world data collection, the treatment is what's prioritized, and the real-world data should come secondary to this, has been explained this morning. However, with some of the appropriate methodology that Hayley covered, minimizing bias around the kind of avoiding of practices such as data dredging, it can provide a fantastic opportunity to gather these insights in the real-world setting, as long as we combine it with good knowledge of local regulations, data privacy, and ethics. Just to really reiterate, when it comes to data privacy and ethics, we talk about these from a provision of treatment point of view, It's extremely important to differentiate them and collect them for the data collection as well, because our patients, data is their own ownership, and we need to make sure that we have the rights to use that data. And this is something that's being recognized increasingly by regulatory and reimbursement authorities. If we get to discuss in the next session, the EMA strategy report now plans to use this data for regulatory submissions moving forward. We know all about the FDA's regulatory framework and guidance around real-world data, but be remiss not to acknowledge some of the limitations, as has been explained in quite a lot of detail over the last couple of days, especially outside of the US. The regulatory landscape is extremely complex, and there is a definite need for harmonization when it comes to the collection of data. Also, adherence to data collection plans can be an issue, and there are things we can put in place to improve the data collection through these types of activities. I want to briefly outline some of the key considerations when it comes to designing and collecting data. The next session will obviously discuss these in a bit more detail, but I wanted to give a quick overview, hopefully to give some food for thought. Firstly, it's vital to start extremely early. I put that in parentheses because there are competing aspects of the program that should take priority around delivery, supply, labeling, etc., that are required for the treatment provision. Global teams should start to engage with local affiliates extremely early, leverage the regulatory understanding and relationships with KOLs that can put some great inputs into the data collection points. Completely covered by the previous two sessions, I think it's really important to think big but go small when it comes to data collection. We really need to think about really prioritizing the types of data we're going to collect. And as was mentioned, 3 to 5 data points should be what we should aim for. And it's important to have input from all the key strategic stakeholders, including market access, commercial, medical affairs, and then combine this with a comprehensive data search, including protocols, clinical trials, trial registries, and that will form our data gap analysis. Once we have our data gap analysis, it's important to refine it down after all that painstaking work to a few key baseline characteristics and critical data points. Once we know what we're going to collect, it's really important to think how we're going to collect that data. Platform selection was mentioned earlier. Using the same platform for provision of treatment through to real-world data can really help with the uptake of data, but there are the limitations. If you're looking for regulatory grade data, you want to think about medical coding, producing TFLs, tables, figures, and listings that regulators like to see. So sometimes you need to use a clinical trial-based platform which can provide these features. Real-world data-specific regs we've mentioned are extremely important. And the last thing and the most important thing is really keeping the patient, their carers, and the medical team in mind when developing this data collection strategy. It's important to keep it to routine clinical practice and to minimize data points to minimize the burden on those involved in collecting that data.
Yeah, thank you, Rakesh. A great introduction to it. And I'm just staring at the results of a poll, and that links quite nicely into, what one of the latter points you referenced, which was regulatory considerations. It's a vast and rapidly evolving landscape in the world of data collection through EAP. We've seen a great surge and lots of legislation and guidelines reflecting that accordingly. Edith, perhaps I can ask you to get the ball rolling on that question. From your point of view, what are the key regulatory considerations?
Thanks, Graham, and I'm not surprised to see that as the number one topic. I think with the regulatory consideration, a lot of what has been said that I'll summarize and punctuate is that it's important to have a regulatory strategy around which countries are you targeting and where the need is and where you're collecting data, and then adapt and have a plan and understand what are the requirements for those countries. I think we can leverage existing where there are some, like has been referenced, the FDA has a real-world evidence, a real-world data path for data submission, and other countries are developing, and it's important for us to stay informed and aware and be able to use those. Using, Haley mentioned the importance of having a structured data collection, having a different protocol, collecting that data so we can ensure the most quality in the data we're collecting. But all of this at the end is while we're enthusiastic about the data collection, we want to ensure we preserve this path of expanded access to patients, and that as we advance this, that we're not creating confusion for what this unique access is for patients, but while we can still benefit and help that patients benefit from collecting that data. Those are some of my thoughts, and I think Rakesh, it would be really great for you to comment a bit more on the diverse regulatory strategies and some of the things we've talked about as you all have helped us as we're developing our programs on how we can better leverage this data.
Thank you, Edith. I completely agree. Firstly, I think it's really important to think of a real-world data-specific regulatory strategy. We have our strategy for the provision of treatment, and there are, as we know, 27 EU countries, and each has its own regulatory route for providing access to treatment, multiple routes within countries as well. And each of those has a difference when it comes to the collection of data. So we really need to map out each country individually when we look at the countries in scope for a program. The other point I'd mention is it's an extremely quickly evolving environment. I mean, we're 2 months into the year on the back of Canada late last year announcing different changes to their mechanism. We've seen France and Spain this year already announce changes that are coming this year, and that will have implications on the data collection aspects as well. I think that the key thing from our perspective is having early dialogue with regulators as well. We're constantly in touch with regulatory agencies, and it's important to reassure them that the data collection will be independent to the provision of treatment, because that's the priority, and also it will not interfere in any way with the clinical development. As I mentioned, explanatory trials are what we need to focus on to prove the efficacy, safety, and quality of our treatments. But this type of data is fantastic, and really communicating that and the reasons for doing that to the regulators has a really positive impact on the data collection and how it's seen moving forward in those various countries. Global teams I mentioned earlier should start to liaise with the local affiliates. They'll have a wealth of knowledge, be running clinical trials in the country, so we'll have that ongoing regulation contact. I think it's important to also state that the outlook is extremely positive for the collection of data when it comes to the regulatory strategy. We've seen probably about 2 years ago now, the FDA released their real world evidence strategic framework, and the guidance calendar looks absolutely packed with well-populated types of discussion points on increasing the use of real world data for regulatory submissions. I mentioned earlier the EMA strategy report that was just released for the first time actually quotes a plan to improve the utilization of real-world data from EAP in future decision-making. So I think we'll finally start to see some harmonization, which I think is really required in this field, and that will help us moving forward.
Yeah, thank you, Rax. Thank you, Edith. I'm cognizant of time just now, and I can also see there's a second question that I just want to get some sort of response from. Hayley, perhaps you can have first pass at this, and it's regarding optimizing strength of data collection through EAP and maximizing uptake. You get the ball rolling there, and I'll pass to the rest of the guys to get a word too.
Yeah, so basically I want to go back to this idea of emulating a target trial. So essentially we want to mimic key attributes of a randomized controlled trial for your real world data protocol. So some of the specific actions that can be taken to do that, actually write a predefined protocol and a statistical analysis plan, even though this is a real world data study, treat it like it's a trial. You can go in, and even though we may not have a reference or control arm, you can use historical controls or some type of matching, especially if it's EHR data, where you can go in and actually access patient records with similar characteristics. So those who did and did not receive treatment. Establish those inclusion and exclusion criteria. It may be another thing to consider is, are you doing retrospective or prospective data collection? Obviously, if it's prospective, you'd get more similarities to an experimental design, which is closer to a randomized controlled trial. Use those analysis methods that adjust for baseline confounders. So basically in your regression models, have your statistical analysts put in those extra variables. And then just in general, a lot of the themes that we've all discussed here. So consider those sources of bias, the diversity of your patient population, how replicable and reproducible are your results. And even from that, performing things like sensitivity analyses, try to figure out, what are those upper and lower bounds on some of these estimates that you're extracting, especially given you probably have a small sample size or a very specific population that you're analyzing. And so really my big message is no statistical model will save poorly collected data. So it's really important to go in from the start and make sure that you are collecting the highest quality data you can and using these measures and approaches that we often see done in clinical trials, even though it is real world data here.
Absolutely, Hayley. Thank you for those insights. Edith, from your perspective, what would you add to the discussion so far?
I couldn't agree more with what Hayley notes, that the quality of the data is what's key. And so we need to take, from an industry perspective, our expertise in clinical trial data collection and look how we can leverage that expertise. I think we also need to think about the collaboration and understanding what are the critical data points that will most benefit, so that it's a limited number of data points. And then we need to partner well to ensure the quality that we're gathering, both safety, efficacy, and any other limited data points, to ensure that that's informing the question that we're answering. So those would be my comments.
Thank you. And Rakesh, I hear you talking a lot about simplicity. We heard from Veronique and Philippe about minimizing the number of data collection points. Anything from your experience that would be valuable to share with the group?
Thank you, Graham. Yes, firstly, completely agree around minimizing the data points. But as Hayley and Edith have mentioned, there are a lot of aspects we can now start to incorporate into this kind of data collection to really strengthen it. So looking at the kind of data we're now collecting, it used to be on, I remember 4 or 5 years ago working with KOLs, often it was just looking at Excel spreadsheets and trying to combine the data points. But now we're looking at protocols, we're borrowing methodology from observational studies, non-interventional style studies, and we're using predefined endpoints, medical coding, and TFL outputs, as I mentioned earlier, and combining that with stats and medical writer input to lead to outputs that are more akin to regulatory and reimbursement standards. The other thing I would mention is to really lean on some fantastic societies and organizations out there like ISPOR that are doing a lot in study design and transparency initiatives. Also, the American Statistical Association have a scientific working group looking at the broader association and utilization of this type of data. So lots of learnings to take on board there. I saw a question come up on the kind of types of data points we're collecting, and we try not to focus too much on the clinical trial type, but we can have adapted clinical trial endpoints. We can look at the setting of these kind of data points as well. So, if you're looking at something like additional transfusions required that's associated with a treatment, we can collect data within the community or the hospital because there are cost implications and utilization implications as well. Another area that's really interesting is prior therapies. So we know in a clinical trial program, patients are often on 100% of prior therapies if they're on a second or third line cancer therapy, for example. This is unrelated to the treatment itself, but reimbursement authorities want to know what's happening in a specific country with those first and second line treatments, and we can collect that kind of information through this space. So the final thing I'll finish on, Graham, is that this is not new, as has been mentioned, the kind of collection we're doing, but also the kind of decisions that are being made as well. Managed access programs within Europe and payer for performance kind of programs collect this kind of real world data and make major funding decisions on this. So if we can remove some of this uncertainty earlier, why not do it using this process as a mechanism to do that?
Well, thank you to all of the panelists. I can see we're coming towards the end of our time now. We've just scratched the surface, actually, of some really complex subjects. I know the team are happy to connect and share experiences, so feel free to reach out. I can also see there's a few questions on the chat, so we'll endeavour to get some responses back to those individuals over the duration of the day. I hope that was a productive and valuable session for everyone in the audience. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and I'll hand back to James to keep the conference ticking along.